Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are today. Thanks for joining our weekly live stream. We do this live stream every Tuesday at this same time. We stream live on YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, and we actually use this interview or this live stream recording as part of our weekly Transformation Ground Control podcast. So you're getting to be part of the live production of that, and at least for the live segment of the podcast, you're getting to be a part of that. So we really appreciate you all being here today. So what we're going to do today is actually, before I introduce the topic here, just real quickly, if you don't mind just dropping in the chat box where you're joining from today. I'd love to hear where in the country you're joining. Whatever part of the world you're in, please let us know. Usually we get a global audience, so it's always interesting to see and hear where people are from. So please drop that in the chat wherever you're watching here today. And also, we are going to be taking lots of questions here today. This is a Q&A session for Kyler and I, so feel free to drop any general questions you've got about digital transformation, or as we get into the discussion, if it triggers other questions or thoughts or comments, please chime in with comments along the way. We'd love to get your feedback and get you involved in the discussion here. So that all being said, what we wanted to do today is talk about starting off talking about some of the questions that we received at our Digital Stratosphere event that we recently wrapped up. And we got a lot of questions we were able to answer and address during the event, but also a lot that we didn't have time to get to. So what we thought we'd do today with today's live stream is use this time to talk about just general Q&A about digital transformation, whatever questions the audience may have, whether it's stuff related to digital strategy and software selection or implementation or change management, process improvement, data migration, whatever the case may be. We'll try our best to answer general questions you have and hopefully open it up for a good discussion. So again, your comments are much appreciated, so please feel free to drop those in the chat as we go here. So to start then, Kyler, and for those of you that don't know Kyler is the co-host with me on my Transformation Ground Control podcast. She also hosts our Digital Stratosphere podcast, and she also is the facilitator of our Digital Stratosphere event that we hosted recently. And so to start, Kyler, what are some of the themes of questions, or what sorts of questions, or how would you summarize the sorts of questions that we got throughout the 3-day event recently?
Yeah, absolutely. So we kicked off the event with a keynote from Eric that talked about digital transformation in the 2020s and kind of future trends. And I thought it might be interesting to not only get your feedback, Eric, but also our audience's feedback, because we got a lot of questions just about what is the definition of digital transformation. And I think that's a really interesting question, just because it's such a hot buzzword in the industry, that I thought it might be interesting to read some of our audience answers and then also your answer as well. So let's hear what you think digital transformation is, and if you can kind of unpack that very hot trend term for us.
Yeah, it was a good question. We did get that several times, or different variations of that question during the event. And it's always interesting because we use that term so often and we almost take it for granted, or I take it for granted at times that people understand what that means. But it is such a broad and such a vague, nebulous term that it is worth unpacking a bit. But generally, the way I describe it in its simplest terms is digital transformation is the use of any sort of technology and process improvements to improve your business. And it's intentionally open-ended and non-technology specific, because some organizations might be looking for an ERP, enterprise-wide sort of technology. Others might be looking for Salesforce automation with CRM products or tools. Others might be looking at human capital management or supply chain management, or some combination of all the above, or other parts of the business. So it really is, looking at different types of technologies, and not just your sort of typical commercial off-the-shelf technologies, which is commonly where a lot of organizations gravitate toward. But there's also other stuff too. You've got robotics and robotic process automation and business intelligence and even custom developed solutions. I mean, there's a lot of different directions that you can go with digital transformation, which is part of what makes it so exciting and cool, but it's also can be very overwhelming to just figure out what direction do we do, assuming that we can't leverage every sort of technology that's out there, nor should we. So that, in its simplest terms, that's how I describe digital transformation. But again, also be curious to hear what the audience thinks as well.
Yeah, actually, Dan on LinkedIn said, "What do you mean by transformation? And if this word is not accurate, what would be a better term?
Yeah, that's a good question because you know, I guess the first question you have to ask yourself is, is this really a true transformation, or is this more of a technical upgrade project? Or maybe even a better way to think about it is thinking of it on a spectrum. If you have sort of on one side of the spectrum is your simpler, not simple but simpler technology upgrades, more incremental improvements to your processes, incremental changes to people's jobs, and then you've got full blown business transformation, which typically is going to deliver potentially more business value, but it's also entailing more risk, more cost, more time to get there. And so I think more than anything, whether or not one answer or one extreme or somewhere in between is right or wrong for you is dependent on who you are as an organization and what you're trying to accomplish. For some organizations that are really trying to swing for the fences or really trying to take those quantum leap improvements to their businesses, it may make perfect sense to go with a full-blown digital transformation. For more risk-averse organizations that have already invested fairly heavily in technology over the years, maybe a more incremental approach is more appropriate. And most organizations fit somewhere in between. So I think that's more than anything just getting alignment on what your goals and objectives of the transformation are with the overall goals and objectives of the business. That's probably the most important thing.
Absolutely. And I know a lot of times the team here at Third Stage actually uses the term business transformation just to make sure that our client community is clear that it really needs to be a business strategic decision when you go through any sort of technology implementation, upgrade, organizational change type of strategies. So that I know that's a term that we use a lot. And then we also got the question, Eric, what is the difference between digital transformation and digitization in as well? And I think that's an interesting um, question as well, because a lot of it has to do with the strategic goals of the organization as opposed to just digital based strategies.
Yeah, I think it gets back to the whole incremental versus full-blown transformation mindset. Digitization is generally viewed as more, we're automating things that are heavily manual or siloed right now. So it's meant to maybe be more of a more of a reactive fix to certain solutions or certain issues or technical debts that your organization has. So it's more of a, sort of that more incremental mindset of let's just automate what we're already doing or some of those manual processes. Whereas digital transformation, typically what comes to mind is more of a proactive rather than a reactive, a proactive, more strategic, thinking forward sort of approach to a technology and process and people sort of change to the business. So I think that's the way I would define it is, are you going out there and trying to find, strategic technologies that are really going to give you a leg up in the marketplace or really take your organization to the next level? Or are you just maybe doing something a little bit more fundamental, which is let's just get our processes off of paper and pen or off of the spreadsheets or whatever and get it into a system? Those are just two different mindsets. And then, the other part of that is different parts of your business might have different answers. There might be parts of your business where you're taking more of a proactive digital transformation, strategic sort of approach. And there might be other parts of your business that are going to be more digitized or digitize. Oh boy.
We should just delete that word from, if we could all just vote to not use that word, just because it's the hardest to say, especially when you're in a live environment, because there's a lot of anxiety of like, am I going to say it right? But
yes, and I have a way of making it sound very difficult to pronounce, which it really shouldn't be that difficult.
No, I struggle with it too. Absolutely.
So different parts of the business might have different answers, and certainly different organizations are going to have different answers as to which is the right path for them.
Absolutely. And I really like this question because it goes into a ton of content we got specifically around the cloud and what those migration strategies look like, or just the overall functionality and capabilities of cloud solutions. So Patrick on LinkedIn asked, how do you stop a digital transformation from becoming lift and shift, which can still be strategic but not transformational? And I like that term because it not only alludes to the lift and shift of the cloud, right? But just the overall holistic view of just moving a technology or a process to a different place instead of really optimizing. Sorry, it's early here in the United States. Um, Optimizing your processes and really finding and kind of mining those processes that could essentially be a better benefit to your business.
Well, I guess I'd say, my knee-jerk reaction to that is, first of all, we have to be careful with the term lift and shift. To me, that's always been a bit misleading because it's another industry term that's meant to suggest that it's going to be easier than it really is. Even if really what you're doing is upgrading to a new technology or migrating existing processes and technical capabilities to the cloud, lift and shift sounds good. I mean, it sounds like that's simple enough and it's not going to be that complex, but lift and shifts actually are fairly complex, especially when you're moving from on-prem to the cloud. It's just different competencies, different technical capabilities, different processes, et cetera. So I think that's the first thing, is just you have to be careful or recognize what that term lift and shift really means. But to Patrick's point on LinkedIn, I think the key here, the way I would view the difference between sort of that lift and shift mentality to more of a transformational approach would be, what are you leading with? Are you leading with a technical problem? So in other words, I've got outdated technology and I need to update that technology or move to the cloud for whatever reason. That might be more that lift and shift mentality. Or am I really looking to rethink my business processes and re-engineer my processes and then figure out how technology might fit within that equation? That typically is going to be viewed as a more strategic or transformational approach. So I think a lot of it depends on what you lead with. Are you leading with technology in a relatively simple and more straightforward upgrade path, or just technology improvement? Or am I trying to improve my business processes, change the way I do business, change roles and responsibilities? Maybe I'm moving to a shared service model. Maybe I'm consolidating parts of the organization or consolidating and standardizing business processes. If that's the case, then you would want to lead with your business processes and your organizational pieces, and then let the technology sort of fall behind that or support that.
Absolutely. And I highly recommend Brad Feeks from the Estes Group. His session was on the 10th. And just a logistic reminder for all of our audience watching right now, you can still watch all of the recordings live by going to stratosphere2022.com. And they're all available for you there for free. So definitely check that out if that's something that you're interested in, cloud specifically. I will kind of shift to our business intelligence panel, which featured Brian Lackaruba and Teresa Richardson. And on kind of this business intelligence or BPM, if you will, model, we talked a lot and had a lot of audience questions about when should you be mapping out your process when it comes to thinking or considering a newer technology. So I wondered if you might speak to that a little bit, Eric.
Yeah, so I think it's, first of all, important to recognize that it's an iterative process. The whole business process improvement or business process management work stream generally is going to be iterative. So generally you would start with sort of your macro processes and work your way down to eventually to where you're getting to the detailed transactional workflows in terms of what buttons you press, what screens you use, within the system or systems you might be using. So it is an iterative process, but generally when you're starting a project, whether it's during the software evaluation phase and or in the early stages of implementation, you want to have a clear vision of what you want your processes to be. And a lot of organizations make the mistake of just deferring to the technology because the technology has best practices or the technology has standard workflows. Mm-hmm. Well, the reality is today's technology is really flexible. The simplest workflows have multiple ways you can do things or set them up with basic configuration. So it's a little misleading, when vendors say that we've got best practices in our technology, because you still have to know what you want to be when you grow up, and you have to let that be your defining factors in terms of how you design and deploy technology. So what I generally recommend, or what we generally recommend to our clients as a team, is that when you're starting a project, ideally during your selection phase, you would define your end-to-end business processes in the future state, not to the degree where it's dependent on technology, because you don't know what the technology is going to be yet necessarily. So we want to do it more from an agnostic, this is just how we need to run our business. This is how information needs to flow. This is what we expect people to do within the processes, and then translate that into business requirements that can then be used to evaluate technology and ultimately the requirements traceability that comes with that when you deploy the technology. So in a perfect world, which isn't always perfect, you'd want to do as much of that business process work up front as you can. And then when you get into the implementation, into the design phase of deploying whatever technologies you're deploying, then you get into more details of, okay, now let's figure out within the parameters of these high level processes we've already defined. Now let's work with the system integrator or the software vendor to determine what our transactional business processes are going to look like. So getting down into that level, that detail level of detail. So that's the way I would suggest it. Is it's iterative, but you do want to do more upfront than you might be thinking, just because it does give you a lot more direction on not only evaluating and finding the right technologies to best fit your needs, but also it just gives you a clearer framework and a clearer blueprint for how you deploy the technologies later on. If you don't do that business process work up front, or at least a good chunk of that business process work up front, what ends up happening is you go to deploy the technology and you either pave the cow paths and just do things the way you've always done things because it's the path of least resistance, or the system integrator just decides for you how the software is going to be set up because you have no idea how you want the processes to look, and or you see that the project spirals out of control in terms of cost and time because you spend your time on the clock. While the meter's running on the project, you're trying to figure out what you want to be when you grow up. And that gets really expensive really fast. And that creates delays, it creates budget overruns and all that sort of thing. So for all those reasons, that's the case for why you'd want to define as much of those business processes as you can upfront.
And what about establishing KPIs or business value? We had a lot of questions about, okay, so I know how to optimize my process. I've selected a technology that I feel like, matches those overall strategies. How do I make sure that I'm measuring or even checking in on project health checks to see that I'm achieving that business value of this investment?
Well, I think the first thing is just recognizing that you do need to define those measures. And so just the fact that that question came up was refreshing because a lot of times we have to sort of not force the issue, but you have to sort of educate clients and try to nudge them towards, maybe you should think about some metrics in terms of what's important to you and how you're going to gauge success with this project. What I'll say as a caveat before I answer the real question is that, which I'm really good at deflecting and answering what I want to answer first, then I'll answer your question.
Go into politics. No, we don't talk about politics.
Yeah, this is the non-political show for sure. But what I was going to say is that if now I totally forgot what we were talking about. What after all that, what was the question again?
Business value. You're talking about business value, KPIs. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So the trap that you have to watch that we see a lot nowadays because of this sort of forced migration to the cloud, whether it's because it's opportunistic and you want to move to the cloud, or the vendors forcing you to move to the cloud, which is the more common scenario. So you have a lot of these organizations that are sort of being forced into these upgrades of sorts. And a lot of times organizations and leadership and the project team sort of stop there and they say, that's our business case right there. The fact that we have to do something, we have to move to the cloud, or we have to upgrade our technology because it's being sunset, or, it's no longer being supported. That might be the reason why, the burning platform for change exists, but you need more than that. You need those metrics to define, something beyond just get off the old system. And it sounds real simple and basic, but so many organizations we work with come in with a mindset of, hey, we don't need a business case. We just need to upgrade our technology because we have no choice. If you don't have a business case, what ends up happening is you end up, first of all, not delivering the value you expect or that you would want. You don't get the ROI that you should be getting because you haven't defined metrics. You don't have that sort of clear vision of what you want to get out of the transformation at the other side. And it also makes the implementation more difficult because you don't have that sort of guiding light or that North Star to direct you when it comes to tough decisions around, do we customize the software? Do we change our processes? Do we take that big risk organizationally to change people's jobs? And, if we don't have a clear business case and clear metrics, you make those decisions in a vacuum or in isolation without consideration of, well, what's the business case say? If the business case can justify customizing software, maybe you do it because you get so much business value out of it, even though it adds to the cost, it adds to the risk, but you can justify it with the business value because you've defined the metrics. If you don't have that, what ends up happening is you have no quantitative measures in place, and it ends up being very political. Speaking of politics, it becomes very political internally and or personal. And so it becomes more of a philosophical debate that oftentimes doesn't end well. But with the business case, it it takes the emotion out of it, it takes the politics out of it, and it focuses on the business results. So I think those are some of the reasons why it's so important. But as far as how you define it, I think the place that we typically start with our clients is look at your corporate or organizational goals and objectives at the highest level, the strategic goals and objectives. Then translate that into how is this transformation going to support those goals and objectives, and what are the specific measures related to this project that can support that. So it could be efficiency based metrics, it could be revenue increase, it could be increased customer satisfaction, reducing inventory, increasing inventory turns, whatever the case may be.
Absolutely. And just to take a quick little lens of all of our listeners today, we've got a huge global audience here. So Algeria, Egypt, UK, where apparently it's rainy. So sorry about that, Malcolm. And then we have a few others here joining us from India. So, just a snapshot of kind of the global audience we have. And I just would like to say that we had a great kind of global sphere of speakers as well. And we'll talk about that just in a little bit. But going on the process side, we did have our head of our APAC region, which is Wayne Holdham, talk about process mining. So he showed us kind of a glimpse into actually utilizing and leveraging technology to find out from your business where there's optimization opportunities. So if you are interested in that, I highly recommend his talk as well, especially for our APAC audience. So I want to address some of Dan's questions. Great questions over here, Dan. And I'm going to start with the organizational side. I thought it was very interesting that during a lot of our business process conversations, we had a lot of questions regarding emerging technologies, automations, predictive analytics, machine learning, and what the people side of that kind of looks like. So if you are considering integrating one of these new technologies, understanding how it's going to change the roles of the resources or people within your organization. And one of the questions that really stuck out to me was, what if their job is moving to kind of a harder job as opposed to something that they were used to doing? So I wondered if you might address that, because I don't know if I've ever heard you talk about that transition before.
Yeah, it's a intuitive question. It's good perception on that, because it is true that we all would like to think that you deploy new technologies and process improvements and everyone's job gets easier, everyone loves it, everyone's happy, everything's great, or everything is awesome, as they say in the Lego movie that my kids used to love before they became teenagers. But the general idea here, though, is that you want to be, first of all, define what the impacts are to everyone's jobs, because there are going to be cases where it does improve a job, it makes their jobs and lives easier, but there are going to be some cases where it's going to make it more difficult. And the most common examples are cases where you are automating a process to the extent that now you're expecting people to enter data into a system, whereas maybe they didn't have to before. Maybe they just relied on pen and paper or Excel spreadsheet or what was in their heads or whatever. They had that tribal knowledge and that sort of thing. Now you're saying, hey, you need to capture this or conduct more business process workflows within a technology. So that can be perceived as a negative, because now you're giving me an extra step in my process. I used to be able to just think through in my head what I'm going to do next or whatever. But now you're telling me I've got to put it in this system, and that adds steps, it adds time or whatever. A common example where we see this more often than not is like in the sales group or customer service. A lot of times sales and customer service are impacted in that way, because now, in the spirit of capturing more data and being able to support analytics and big data and business intelligence and all that stuff, now you're expecting sales and customer service people to capture more information about their customers, let's say as an example. Well, if I'm a salesperson, that's hard for me to adjust, because not only because I'm human and I just don't like change, but also because there's a perception that, well, I'm paid on commission, so you're asking me to do something administrative and you're adding to my overhead burden. It doesn't produce any extra commission for me. So that's where the resistance oftentimes comes from. So oftentimes what you have to do is first of all, define if it's true. You don't want to make this up, but if there is a case to be made that actually you can sell more, and here's how, with these new tools and these new processes, then that's the easy answer, because if you can make it about them and what's in it for me, that's always an easier sell. But that's not always the case. There are cases where, hey, this is just making your life more difficult, for whatever reason, for better, for worse. So then you have to sort of step back and paint the vision of why we're doing this. We're not doing this to make Kyler's job more difficult or because we want Kyler to be frustrated. We're doing it because we need to capture this information, and here's how we use it, and here's how it helps the organization overall. Usually you can find a way to trace that back to how it helps you as an individual too, which is ideal. Like I said, if you can trace it back to individuals rather than just the organization, that helps as well. So those are just some tips that come to mind as it relates to that.
Absolutely. And our audience referenced over here kind of the why behind that, not only from the processes side, but also from the people side as well. And we had Teresa Richardson, one of our senior managers here, do a great presentation on organizational change management. And she brings an excellent perspective to the table because she is a process analyst. She actually does have kind of that data background, but also really understands the impact and the overall disruption that can happen to the business if organizational change is not considered. So speaking to that, we had a lot of people ask about the board of directors or the executive team and explaining the importance of investing in organizational change and really showcasing that. That can be a big barrier for a lot of project leads or sponsors that really have to say like, hey, we have to invest in these organizational change strategies or it actually will very much impact our KPIs, whether that's user adoption or what we're looking at as far as business value. So I wondered if you could kind of reiterate how you might be able to do that and showcase that this is a hard science investment, not just, high fives and sunshine and rainbows, to steal Teresa's words.
Yeah, I think that's well stated in terms of it. It isn't just sunshines and rainbows, and a lot of executives view it that way. Partially because the word itself or the term itself is so vague. I mean, organizational change management. If you stop to think about it, what does that really mean? And so that's part of why I think people struggle. So I think connecting the dots, to your point, connecting the dots between what we're doing in a transformation and how we get business value is there's sort of a chasm there. You've got over here, you've got a project, you've got a transformation project that has the potential to deliver real business value and really transform and change the way we do business. Over here, you've got sort of the business value. These are the metrics or the things that we can achieve with that transformation. But it doesn't just happen because you did the project. You've got to connect the dots or sort of enable that with the change management. So it really is a way to bridge that chasm or that divide between, technology project over here, business value over here. It doesn't happen with the technology. It doesn't even happen with the business processes. Where it really happens is with the change management. So if you can quantify a business case and say, yeah, that's the potential, but that's if we invest in organizational change. If we don't invest in organizational change, it's okay to quantify that too. What does that look like in terms of lost business value and or a lot of times what really gets executives' attention is operational disruption. Let's talk about what it means if we have a major operational disruption at the time of go live. How big of a deal is that to us? If we, let's just say we're a manufacturing or distribution organization and we can't ship product for 2 weeks or 6 weeks or whatever. What is that impact to our bottom line? And then you look at that and say, well, that's a likely scenario because we know from research and experience that over half of organizations experience some sort of major operational disruption at the time they go live with new technologies. Most executives don't like those odds. They don't like those 50-50 coin flip odds that, there's a 50-50 chance that we have some sort of major disruption and can't ship product and lose millions of dollars of customer orders. That's usually not acceptable to executive teams, or it should not be acceptable. And so that's the way you have to look at it is, quantifying it in that way and showing how the project itself needs to connect to the business value, and change management is typically the way to do that.
Absolutely. And Eric gave a great keynote for our audience that will watch the replays on day 2, which was the 9th. He kicked it off with an executive summary of transformation best practices, and organizational change was actually the number one tactic that he had referenced at the end of his talk. So definitely take some tactics from Teresa and Eric as well. I want to shift a little bit to talk about just the technology piece of it. So we kind of covered a snapshot of the process, a snapshot of the people, and then just a reminder to our audience, pop any questions in your comment section, wherever you're watching, YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, we can see them all right here. So when we talk about the cloud, and that seemed to be something that was, a main theme of our questions here, was just when we talk about migrating to the cloud, it seems as though when we're in vendor conversations or anything like that, that's kind of the push to go into make that change to the cloud. Even so much so that we see main vendors, sunsetting systems so they can try and get other users and businesses in the cloud. And you've been a proponent of the cloud is a great emerging technology, but it's not what an on-prem system is. So I wondered if you might give us kind of just some insight of what you talked about when you said you need to consider the technology, the capabilities, and then also the budget as well in shifting to a cloud solution.
Yeah, I mean, I think cloud is obviously becoming more and more prevalent. More systems and vendors are making that shift to the cloud, and in many cases, they're limiting the on-premise options that are still available. And in more extreme cases, there's vendors that are pushing their legacy on-premise customers to shift to the cloud, or else they'll stop supporting those old
Mhm.
on-prem systems. So I guess the first thing I'd say that I know the industry doesn't always appreciate me saying, but being technology agnostic and independent and unaffiliated with vendors, I can say this, and that is that you have to look at your business needs and migrate to the cloud if and when it makes sense to you. You can't let software vendors determine that for you. And nothing, and when I say nothing, I think this is, I've never really thought this through until now, but I don't think there's anything that really irritates me more about the industry than this whole cloud migration thing. I
Mhm.
mean, the way that vendors are stiff arming their customers into migrating to the cloud and overselling the capabilities of the cloud, it's super irritating, and it's really destructive, and risky for organizations to be falling for that sales message hook, line, and sinker. So you just have to step back and look at your business, forget the technology, forget what the vendors want you to do, forget what Gartner and Forrester are telling you should do in terms of, if you're not in the cloud, then you're going to be dead in 5 years or whatever. I'm exaggerating, but that's sort of the message you oftentimes hear from industry analysts too, who, by the way, are also paid by the software vendors to perpetuate the value of the cloud. So look around you and recognize you're getting biased information. It's a closed feedback loop between software vendors, system integrators, the industry analysts. They're all telling you the same thing, which is you got to move to the cloud. I would just ignore all that. That's just noise. What you have to focus on is your business and what your business value is, or your business or your value proposition, and how technology is going to help that. So back to your real question again. I'm deflecting a bit, or venting for a moment on my soapbox. But you have to look at the where the incentives are coming from, and that is the vendors want you to move to the cloud because they make more money. It's more profitable for them. Investors love it. Their stock price does better the more cloud revenue they have. So what you do then is you say, okay, let's just say you're going to move to the cloud. You recognize the value of it, and maybe the vendors are forcing you, and you feel like it's time to move to the cloud for whatever reason. Then you've got to look at, well, what am I really getting in the cloud? Because a lot of these legacy systems, especially the ones that were built on-prem, which most technologies that have been around for a while were built on-prem, you have to look at, well, what am I really getting with this cloud solution versus what I might have had with an on-premise solution? Because oftentimes there's gaps there. The cloud systems that are out there, many of them have not yet made the full leap from the capabilities that they had on-prem because they haven't had 10, 20, or 30 years of R&D behind it like they have with on-prem. So if you're looking at SAP or Oracle or Microsoft or one of those legacy enterprise providers, you just have to recognize that you're probably not going to get as much capability or maturity in the business processes and the general capabilities as you might have had with your on-premise. Now, the long-term potential is there that they'll catch up, and they're certainly going to introduce new capabilities that you can't get with on-prem. So things like Internet of Things and predictive analytics and integration becomes a little bit easier. There's a lot of value in the cloud. I don't want to be dismissive of that, but you also have to recognize the dark side of the cloud, and there is an absolute dark side that many don't want to talk about. So just going in with your eyes wide open and being objective and taking the vendor bias and spin, or the industry bias and spin, with a grain of salt is really important.
Absolutely. And I'll just add that Marcus Harris, who is an attorney, an ERP focused attorney from Taft Law, who is also one of our sponsors of the event, gave a really interesting talk on digital transformation and contracting. And he referenced the cloud multiple times, and just making sure that as a business, you're very clear in your contracting about not only your needs when it comes to software, but also the budgeting when it comes to cloud, because apparently in his and probably yours too, Eric, experience, it can kind of be sneaky in the contracting phase, that it's not clear as to what the business is spending. So he talked a lot about just really investing, or kind of arming yourself with the knowledge of what the cloud actually costs. And I think that's something you've kind of experienced too, right, Eric?
Yeah. I mean, I know in the sessions, or one of the sessions that I presented at Stratosphere, one of the sessions had a question that came up about cloud. We were talking about this whole thread here that we're talking now, which is the cost benefit of cloud. And there was someone from a software vendor on there that was sort of chatting in the live chat. They're commenting on how, yeah, but you have to consider, it may cost you more because you have these ongoing perpetual subscriptions that never go away. By the way, on premise, you have one big capital cost outlay, but then you have sort of a lower ongoing maintenance cost. Whereas with SaaS or cloud solutions, you generally are going to have just an ongoing cost that never goes away and continues to escalate over time. So I was basically saying that after 5 to 7 years, that's generally sort of that break even, or that threshold where it starts to become more expensive for cloud, because it's a lot like leasing a car. That payment never goes away. Where if you had bought your car, it's more money up front, and you've got some additional maintenance you've got to do because the car is getting older or whatever. But in general, it's still going to cost you less than leasing. So I was making that point in the person from the vendor, one of the well-known software vendors, was saying, hey, but you've got to consider all the money you save with servers and infrastructure and stuff like that. And that is true. You are saving some money there, but usually that's not even anywhere close to justifying the cost. Now, you might be able to justify the cost in other ways, but you can't go in expecting that you're going to save money on a cloud deployment, because I don't know. I mean, I've probably seen it at some point, so I don't want to say I've never seen it, but it's very rare, if I have seen it, where a company actually, at the end of the day, saved money because they went to the cloud. Usually they're paying more, but usually they can justify it with more business value. And they save some money, by not having the infrastructure and the servers and all that stuff. But think of how cheap servers are now. It doesn't cost you that much to build an infrastructure. It's complicated. It's annoying. Most organizations don't want to do it anymore, or a lot of them don't want to do it anymore. And they are moving away from that model. But that cost savings alone generally isn't enough to justify it. So you've got to look at what the business value is. So I think that's an important consideration.
Yeah, and to summarize, both you and Marcus, I don't think anyone is saying that the cloud is a bad option. It's just the awareness around what you need as a business, and making sure from a contractual and just over a strategic standpoint that you understand what that overall shift will mean for your business, and just understand the lag, right, between using an on-prem, very mature system to moving to a cloud solution that might not be as mature at this point. As we all know, it takes time to build out those capabilities.
Yeah.
And then when it comes, I want to touch on just, I'm shifting a little bit here just because of our audience. We've got a lot of people joining from Africa. And I just want to touch on kind of the opening of the Third Stage Africa office, as well as the emerging technologies keynote that Clifford Martin did from our Africa office, who's based in Cape Town, and just talking about the challenges within that marketplace of finding resources. A lot of times we see in emerging markets, finding the right SIs, finding the right vendors, even the right consultants that are able to understand the complexities of newer markets that might not have things like a lot of connectivity. So I thought I might just ask for our viewers here if you could summarize some of the tactics that the Third Stage Africa team, as well as our global team, utilize in emerging markets to help find the right technology, and then also understand what that might mean from a resourcing standpoint.
Yeah. So, I think it's an important consideration, just to recognize that throughout the world, no matter what part of the world you're in, whether it's, where we're at in the United States or Europe, Africa, Asia Pacific, Latin America, Middle East, wherever it is, you want to recognize and assess not just functional capabilities of the technology, but what is that sort of ecosystem that's there to support you regionally or locally. And, you've got varying inconsistent I'd say, in terms of how different software vendors and their ecosystems are supported in those different regions. So, I'll give you an example. You look at a product like, there's some products like IFS or Odoo. Their two software vendors are pretty common in Europe. But when you get outside of Europe, in those two cases with IFS and Odoo, even in North America, you don't have as many resources available, and there's not as strong of an ecosystem built in North America and other parts of the world as you might see in Europe. So that's the kind of thing you have to think about. And even if one of those products is a great fit for you, but the ecosystem isn't as strong where you're at, you just have to be aware of it. It doesn't mean you don't do anything. You don't deploy that technology. It may mean that you've got to figure out, factor in the fact that you might need international resources, or it might take you longer to deploy the technology because there's not as many resources available, or it might cost you a little bit more. Whatever the case may be, you just want to have a good understanding of what that, overall strategy and related costs are. But just understanding, not just the software capabilities, how many organizations in your part of the world are using it, but also how many consultants are there that use it. Is it hard to find consultants that are specialists in that area, or system integrators of ours? Or are you going to have to look overseas, which isn't the end of the world, but you do want to be aware of that before you make your decisions.
Absolutely. And I highly recommend, if you are in the Africa market, to check out that keynote from Clifford and Adam, which happened on the 8th. And ironically, during that session, my internet went out when we were talking about connectivity in Africa. So it's a challenge for everyone everywhere.
Right. Doesn't matter where you are.
Irony of the entire situation. But I want to take this question from Dan over here too, because I feel like it's an interesting one. It's kind of long, so I'm going to read it. But in most capitalist organizations, you have three organizational structures occurring simultaneously: formal hierarchy, informal relationships, and value creation. The formal hierarchy takes value from the delivery teams. The informal hierarchy provides the social glue enabling the organization. How do you reduce the formal hierarchy to allow the organization to maximize the realization of value? So really deep question here. I feel like Dan might be some sort of professor of some sort.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I thought we had a genius IQ level
I know, right?
attendee policy here to make us look like we're not as smart.
Right. But I just think that is a very interesting question, because, how do we kind of talked about the formal hierarchy, and sometimes they can be a huge barrier to digital transformation, when a lot of times we want to transition that to be more of an enabler, and maximize that realization of value. So I just thought we kind of speak to that for a minute.
Yeah, I mean, it's an awesome question because, again, it's one of those questions where just the fact that the question is coming up is huge. I mean, the fact that someone's thinking about organizational design and how we structure our organization in the context of a discussion around digital transformation, it's almost counterintuitive. And a lot of organizations are like, I imagine there might be people on this listening to this discussion right now that are thinking, what does that have to do with digital transformation? Informal hierarchies, that has nothing to do with digital transformation. Well, actually, it does. To Dan's point, it has a lot to do with it, or it should have a lot to do with it. And whether you like it or not, it will have a lot to do with it. It's just a matter of whether or not you determine what impact it has on your business value creation or not. But I think the key here, I don't want to get into a whole lot of, generalizations about whether or not, highly structured and more formal organizations are better or worse than the more informal, less structured organizations. But to Dan's point, every organization has some formality, some informality, and then the value creation that comes with it as well. And so I think the key is, again, getting back to that future state, when you're defining your vision for the project, and even before you start implementing solutions, you want to be thinking about this question. I mean, this is the kind of question you want to ask before you get into the design and testing of technology. You want to be thinking about this stuff like in your evaluation, your strategy workshops or process, and or your implementation planning and readiness. Before the system integrator or the technical resources start building stuff, figure this out, because when you have to figure out that org structure and how people's jobs and roles and reporting relationships are all going to work together in conjunction with new processes and new technologies to create that business value. And I think the other thing too that you want to do, in addition to just doing this, I think that's probably the simplest thing I could say, is just do that. Everything that Dan just asked, even though it's a very important, broad question, and there's a lot of details within that. way you would do that, but you do want to just do it. I mean, or focus on it and get people's minds around this whole organizational design piece. So I think that's the probably the most important thing.
Absolutely. Great question, Dan. And if you are a professor, just let me know because I like to guess people's jobs. That's my favorite thing to do on the live stream. But I will mention that when it comes to organizational design and kind of going through that, Teresa went through a lot of what those tactics are in her organizational change talk. We also had Jed Hafer, who's an emotional intelligence expert, on after my culture keynote. So that was kind of a nice packaging to be able to talk about formal hierarchy has a place, but also kind of the perspective of the employee. And again, to our point, that why behind it. And I thought that was we had a lot of interesting questions about just overall team design and support design when it came to new technology initiatives. What if you have a toxic person on that team? And it made me realize we've never really talked about openly in our podcasts the methodology behind change management. And essentially, we don't ever go in the room to say, oh, you're going to fire Eric and you're going to fire Kyler. That's never how we approach it. It's always discovering that why behind the resistance. So I think that is just kind of going along with just that organizational structure and really digging up where there's going to be any barriers. So great question, Dan.
Yeah, and I'd add to that too. You get the occasional toxic, just flat out resistor or sabotager, if that's a word, person that wants to sabotage the project. Um, that occasionally happens, but actually, in some ways, that's better because you at least see it. It's obvious. You can deal with it head on. That's easier in many ways than the more widespread, more common sort of unintentional resistance. And what I mean by that is, there's a difference between someone that just flat out does not like this idea of changing technologies, or, I'm a Microsoft guy or gal, and, we're moving to SAP. I just don't like that. And so I'm going to dig in my heels and sort of resist it. That's not that common. But what's the bigger risk is when, on the surface, I'm excited about the project. I'm supportive. I'm behind it. I'm going to support it until it gets to the point where it affects me and I start to realize, wow, this is going to affect my role in some way. And there's a perceived threat there. So once I get that perceived threat, I might have the best of intentions. I'm not a toxic person, but yet I'm still resisting change, unintentionally, below the surface, below the radar. That's the harder stuff to manage because it's more widespread and it's harder to see. A lot of times people see the stuff on the surface, which is, oh, Eric's excited. Well, yeah, I'm excited for other people to change. But when you tell me you're taking away my spreadsheet or my, the value that you place on my tribal knowledge, now I'm not quite as excited as I was. But I'm still excited for Kyler to change, though. Kyler will really do well with these new tools. But for me, I kind of need to stick to that spreadsheet because that's sort of the way I do things. So, so it's easy to misinterpret that as being supportive when really I'm not being supportive.
Really? Yeah. And that's a great point in being able to address that head on, right? And create, like you, Eric, created this amazing spreadsheet and this great process that you developed. And a lot of times that's true for our smaller businesses. And that is such an asset. And here's how you can continue to be an asset by leveraging the new technology that we're here to make your job easier. But that conversation has to happen, not that it can just be assumed that that person is going to make that leap. So a lot of times I think we can see that through a lot of things like our culture and change assessments and then tweak the strategy. And I know you talk a lot about this for change management, is there truly is no cookie cutter approach to change management. There's some great models out there, but each business is going to have their own unique change needs when it comes to addressing a new technology because they'll have their own unique culture as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think this is a good question. We have a question here from LinkedIn about digital transformations, kind of a good full circle question because we started to define it at the beginning. So I think it's a good one to close out with from our audience questions. So I'm going to read it. Why is there suddenly this hype about digital transformation? Haven't we always been transforming and aren't we always going to be transforming? those are mostly rhetorical questions. But how does organization succeed with this digital improvement without getting caught up in the digital transformation hype and end up transforming for the sake of not being left behind instead of for really adding business value? Really good question.
Yeah, it's an awesome question. It is a good way to bring it full circle back to the, what is digital transformation question that we started the segment with. But I'd say I totally agree with Farhad on LinkedIn who made that comment in question. I'd say that it is a good point that, there is all this hype around digital transformation, which is I use it all the time. I'm not a fan of buzzwords, but I'm just as guilty as anyone is using that term. That's an industry generated buzzword. That's, the meaning to an organization and how it fits to your organization. That's open to interpretation. So you're right on one hand that, there's nothing new here. The technology is all new. Yes, there's cool new capabilities that can be enabled with some of these new technologies. But at the end of the day, to Farhad's point, yes, we're just changing. We're just trying to improve. And as a successful organization, we have to be changing. We have to be improving and looking for ways to be better. And digital transformation is just one part of that. But I think, though, there's some really good underlying questions or points here within her general comments here, which is that you can't get caught up in the digital transformation hype. For example, we talked about cloud and how it's pretty mainstream now, but just because it's mainstream and just because just because a majority of organizations are starting to go that direction doesn't mean it's right for you. It could mean that it's right for you, but maybe not. And that's the way you have to look at any sort of technology. When you think about artificial intelligence or machine learning or robotic process automation, whatever it is, cool stuff, be aware of it, educate yourself, but there's such a thing as bleeding edge. It might be too early for you to use some of these technologies realistically within your organization. It might be something you look at on the horizon, 5 years from now or 7 years from now. But there might be more fundamental, higher value things you could be doing right now. So you have to look at that whole equation. And it's also back to that whole business case and ROI and business metric discussion that we had earlier in the segment too. You have to know what those metrics are, where you expect to unlock and achieve the business value to know how technology can best help you get there. If you don't have those metrics and the business case is clearly defined, you're going to be a lot more likely or susceptible to fall into the trap of leverage or trying to leverage technology that isn't going to deliver value. It's just going to be a money pit, or it's going to overcomplicate your business without delivering the expectations.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that comes from, maybe a new C-suite member that's a chief innovation officer that's talking about transformation and bringing in those experts that really can level set and almost navigate the conversation through the industry. We talk to people like Marcus Harris, who, is actually an ERP or software attorney. And then Third Stage obviously comes in and kind of says, yes, digital transformation is great, but let's really unpack like what exactly we're talking about as far as an organization and what that might mean. So great questions. And I want to thank all of our audience members. And just a reminder, we do this every Tuesday morning. So bring your questions. We always love to hear from you and address whatever conversations you're looking for as relevant content. And thank you, Eric, for joining us today for another Q&A. Even though you already did a Q&A. So,
happy to do it.
Right. So again, if you visit stratosphere2022.com, you can see all of the replays from our Stratosphere conference. It was a 3-day conference. It was jam-packed full of not only technology insights, but people and process as well. So I highly recommend it. It is completely free, and we'd love to hear your feedback as well.
Yeah, it is a good event. A lot of diverse speakers there. You and I are on there. You moderated the whole thing, so you're all over the place.
You can't get rid of me. I was there the whole time.
Exactly.
Yeah. Right.
I had a few sessions, and we had maybe a dozen other speakers or so throughout those 3 days. So really good stuff. So I encourage you to download or stream the event. You can watch whichever ones you want via recording just by registering at that website that Kyler mentioned. All right. Well, good deal. Well, thanks for having this discussion here with us. Thanks for all the great questions too. We came in with some questions from the actual event that we were planning to go through. We got through some of them, but thank you to the audience here live that asked all the great questions here. These were really good questions, and honestly, it forced my brain to fire up a little bit faster in the morning here in the U.S. than it normally
Yeah,
does. So I
thank you.
appreciate that, because now my brain's in gear, and I don't need quite as much caffeine as I might otherwise. So thanks to everyone for offering these great questions here. So every Tuesday, you can find us next Tuesday, same time, same place, LinkedIn, YouTube, Twitter, Facebook. You could also find this interview and other interviews, other segments, and other content that we produce and release every Wednesday on the Transformation Ground Control podcast. So that'll come out tomorrow. Will be the new episode featuring not this interview, but others we've done in the past. And you'll be able to hear that interview here on these same platforms, as well as all the audio platforms as well. If you subscribe to podcasts on any of the audio platforms like Amazon or Google or Spotify or whatever, you can find Transformation Ground Control there too as well. So be sure to check that out as well on Wednesdays, new episodes. And thank everyone for all the great questions in the meantime. Hope you have a great week, and we'll see you all soon. Take care. Bye.
Bye, everyone.